The Rosarium Philosophorum, or Rosary of the Philosophers, is among the most important and visually rich works in the history of alchemy. Created in the mid-16th century, it presents a sequence of 20 emblematic woodcuts that together narrate the great opus alchemicum, the alchemical work of transformation. To the medieval alchemists, these images describe the refinement of matter, the union of sulfur and mercury, the purification of elements, and the creation of the philosopher's stone. But centuries later, Carl Gustav Jung recognized that these images pointed inward toward the hidden life of the psyche. For Jung, the Rosarium was not about the manipulation of metals, but about the transformation of consciousness. The alchemists, he believed, projected their inner psychic processes onto matter, giving form and symbol to the deep work of individuation. The journey toward wholeness. The Rosarium begins with duality. The second image shows the Rex and Regina, the king and queen, representing the masculine and feminine principles. They are the archetypal opposites within the human soul. The king symbolizes the spirit, the rational, the active principle. The queen represents the soul, the emotional, the receptive. In Jungian terms, these are the conscious ego and the unconscious anima or animus. Their separation signifies the divided state of the psyche, the tension between intellect and instinct, order and chaos, light and shadow. True transformation, however, begins when these opposites confront each other. The next image shows their meeting, the conjunctio, the sacred marriage. The king and queen enter the alchemical bath, the vas hermeticum, symbol of the unconscious where opposing forces are dissolved and recombined. This moment corresponds to the psychological confrontation between the ego and the unconscious, a union that is both creative and destructive. In the conjunctio, the opposites merge. But this union leads not to peace, but to death. The next image depicts the death of the royal pair. Their bodies lie lifeless in the bath, surrounded by blackness. This is the nigredo, the blackening, the first stage of the alchemical opus. For Jung, the nigredo represents the experience of psychic disintegration, the dark night of the soul when old structures of identity collapse. It is the descent into the unconscious, the moment when the ego must die to allow new life to emerge. Depression, confusion, despair, these are the psychological equivalents of the alchemist's nigerdostage. The death of the king and queen symbolizes the death of duality, the breakdown of old oppositions that must precede renewal. From the darkness of the nigredo arises a new light, the albedo, the whitening. The next images show the resurrection of the king and queen, their purified forms emerging from the waters. They are no longer separate, no longer bound by polarity. They have been cleansed and transformed. Psychologically, this stage corresponds to the illumination that follows the dark night, the dawning of insight, and the reordering of the psyche after chaos. The opposites are reconciled, and a new harmony begins to form. From their renewed union is born the Filius Philosophorum, the child of the philosophers. This miraculous birth is the central mystery of the Rosarium. The divine child emerges between the king and queen, sometimes shown standing upon a lotus, sometimes held in their arms. In Jungian psychology, the Filius Philosophorum is the symbol of the self, the archetype of wholeness that transcends the conflict of opposites. It is the new center of the personality, arising from the synthesis of conscious and unconscious. The child represents potentiality, renewal, and divine unity. Just as in mythology the divine child is both fragile and immortal, the Filius embodies the paradox of transformation. It is the result of death and dissolution, yet it carries the promise of eternal life. The birth of the child marks the beginning of the rubedo, the reddening, the final stage of the alchemical work. The rubedo signifies the integration of the entire personality, the reconciliation of matter and spirit, the emergence of individuality in its fullest sense. In later images of the Rosarium, the child grows and becomes the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone. The stone is the final goal of alchemy, the substance that can transmute base metals into gold, heal all wounds, and confer immortality. Jung interpreted it as the ultimate symbol of individuation, the realization of the self, the eternal and incorruptible essence of being. The stone is both material and spiritual, both one and many. It holds the opposites together in perfect balance. It is the image of psychic wholeness, the synthesis of the fragmented personality into a unified whole. The alchemist's long and painful work of purification reflects the psychological process by which an individual confronts, integrates, and transcends inner conflict. The vas hermeticum, the sealed vessel in which all these transformations occur, corresponds to the container of consciousness. In analysis, this is the psychic space where opposites, ego and shadow, persona and anima, consciousness and the unconscious, are held together without repression or avoidance. The heat applied to the vessel, the constant tension of opposites, generates transformation. Jung compared this to the analytic process itself, where the patient and analyst together create the alchemical container in which psychic material can be observed, endured, and transformed. Each image in the Rosarium depicts a stage in this inner drama, the meeting of opposites, their union and death, their dissolution and rebirth, the emergence of the divine child, and finally the creation of the stone. The sequence forms a map of psychic development, illustrating how consciousness evolves through conflict, loss, and renewal. The alchemists, in their symbolic language, describe the same processes that modern psychology encounters in the depths of the psyche. They called it opus magnum, the great work. Jung called it individuation. Both describe the same mystery, the transformation of the human being into a state of inner unity. Thus, the Rosarium Philosophorum is not a relic of superstition, but a psychological masterpiece. Its imagery speaks to the timeless experience of transformation that occurs whenever one confronts the unconscious. The alchemist's vessels, flames, and metals are metaphors for the inner struggle toward wholeness. The king and queen are the divided parts of the soul. Their death and resurrection symbolize the necessary suffering that precedes integration. The divine child and the stone represent the realization of the self. The psychology of alchemy, as revealed through the Rosarium, is the psychology of transformation itself, the eternal cycle of death and rebirth within the human spirit. It teaches that gold is not found in the world, but within, in the heart that has endured dissolution and emerged whole. In this sense, the alchemists were the first depth psychologists, and the Rosarium Philosophorum remains their most profound mirror of the soul. The creation of the alchemical stone, the lapis philosophorum, has stood for centuries as the deepest mystery of alchemy, the hidden goal behind the countless experiments, symbols, and allegories that filled the manuscripts of the adepts. Outwardly, it appeared to be a work of natural philosophy, a process of transforming base metals into gold, purifying matter to its most incorruptible form. But inwardly, as Carl Gustav Jung would later recognize, it was a symbolic account of the transformation of the psyche. The alchemists, working in their dark laboratories, were in truth performing a sacred drama of the soul. They projected their inner experience, their struggles with the unconscious, their encounters with the divine, their descent into despair and ascent into illumination, into the language of chemistry. The stone, then, was not a mineral, but a symbol of psychic totality, the union of all opposites, the synthesis of conscious and unconscious, the realization of the self. The alchemical opus was, in Jung's view, the oldest and most complete symbolic system for the process he called individuation. The work of creating the stone begins not with light, but with darkness, with the nigredo, the blackening. The alchemists described this as the putrefaction of matter, the decomposition of the old forms, the rotting that precedes renewal. Psychologically, this corresponds to the stage of dissolution and disorientation, when the old structures of consciousness begin to break down. The ego, which has long believed itself to be sovereign, encounters the vast and uncontrollable forces of the unconscious. This confrontation produces confusion, suffering, and despair. The alchemist's matter is reduced to a chaotic black mass. The individual feels lost, emptied, and stripped of certainty. Yet this dark stage is necessary, for only through symbolic death can transformation begin. Jung compared the nigredo to the experience of depression or the dark night of the soul, when the ego's illusions are shattered and the deeper layers of the psyche are forced into view within this blackness. A new light begins to glimmer, the albedo, or whitening. The alchemists wrote that the matter was cleansed in the bath, purified by the waters of the unconscious. The vas hermeticum, the sealed vessel of the work, is the symbol of the psyche itself, an inner container in which the conflict of opposites is held and endured. As the alchemist heats his material with steady fire, so the individual applies the fire of awareness, the conscious effort to face the contents of the unconscious without judgment. Slowly, clarity begins to emerge. The opposites that once seemed irreconcilable, light and dark, masculine and feminine, spirit and body, are seen as complementary aspects of a single reality. The albedo brings purification, insight, and renewal, though the ego has not yet integrated what it has glimpsed. This stage corresponds to moments of illumination and psychological rebirth, when the individual experiences an expansion of consciousness and the first realization of inner unity. After the albedo comes the citronitis, the yellowing, the dawning of the inner sun. Here the purified matter begins to shine with its own light. For Jung, this symbolizes the emergence of the self into conscious awareness, the moment when the deeper center of the psyche begins to guide the individual's development. The citronitas represents the embodiment of insight, the integration of what was once only seen intuitively. In this stage, the opposites are not only reconciled in vision, but actively lived. Consciousness becomes radiant, balanced, and creative. The alchemists described this as the marriage of the sun and the moon, the conjunction of spirit and soul, from which the Filius Philosophorum, the child of the philosophers, is born. This divine child, born from the coniunctio oppositorum, is the living symbol of the self. It is the new center of the personality, arising from the union of opposites within the psyche. In Jung's interpretation, the child is both a symbol of potential and of completion. It embodies the wholeness that the ego has yet to fully realize. The alchemist depicted the Filius as both human and divine, mortal and eternal, fragile and radiant. It is a paradox, just like the self, which unites what is above and what is below, the temporal and the eternal. In the language of alchemy, this child gradually matures through further transformations until it becomes the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone, the perfected state of being. The final stage, the rubedo or reddening, marks the completion of the opus. The red symbolizes life, vitality, and the union of spirit and matter. The work is no longer abstract or spiritual only. It is incarnated in the material world. The stone has been created, fixed, permanent, incorruptible. Psychologically, this represents the realization of the self in the individual's life, the integration of the opposites into a dynamic and living unity. The self is not an ideal state of purity, but a condition of wholeness in which all aspects of the psyche, light and shadow, reason and instinct, masculine and feminine, are accepted and harmonized. The person who has realized the stone lives from an inner center rather than from fragmentation or conflict. This is the true gold of alchemy, not the transmutation of metals, but the transmutation of the soul. The lapis is described in the old texts as una residential et res omnis, the one thing and the all thing. It is said to be both small and vast, hard and fluid, mortal and eternal. These paradoxes express its psychological nature. It is the image of totality, of a consciousness that has embraced its own opposites. Jung saw in the stone an archetypal image of the self, the inner God image that seeks realization in each human being. The alchemists called it the sun of the sun, the microcosmic reflection of the divine. To create the stone is to bring this divine center into awareness, to incarnate the eternal within the finite. The process of producing the stone took place within the vas hermeticum, a sealed vessel heated by a gentle and continuous flame. In psychological terms, this vessel is the analytic or meditative process itself, the inner container in which transformation unfolds. The heat corresponds to psychic tension, the conflict between opposites that must be endured until a new synthesis emerges. If the vessel breaks, the process fails. If the fire is too strong, the matter burns. If too weak, nothing happens. This delicate balance mirrors the conditions of psychological transformation. Awareness must be sustained without repression or premature resolution. The alchemist's task, like that of the analyst or the seeker, is to hold the tension of the opposites until the transmutation occurs spontaneously. Jung often quoted the alchemical maxim solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. This describes the entire rhythm of the opus, breaking down rigid forms and reuniting them into higher wholes. In life, this means dissolving one's attachments, certainties, and identifications, allowing the unconscious to speak, and then reforming a more integrated personality. Each cycle of dissolution and renewal brings the individual closer to the stone, closer to the realization of the self. Jung interpreted this as a metaphor for psychic healing, the restoration of inner unity where the soul has been torn by conflict. The stone heals because it represents the experience of wholeness, of being reconciled with one's own shadow and contradictions. It is the inner foundation of meaning, the immovable center that gives life coherence. The creation of the stone is thus the journey from fragmentation to unity, from unconsciousness to self-knowledge, from matter to spirit and back again. In the end, the philosopher's stone is not a material object but a symbol of transformation, the mystery of consciousness becoming aware of itself. It is the eternal core within every human being, hidden in the chaos of the unconscious, waiting to be awakened. The alchemical texts remind us that the stone cannot be found by force or intellect alone. It is discovered only through the purification of the soul, through patience, humility, and the willingness to endure transformation. The work is both universal and personal, cosmic and intimate. The alchemist who succeeds in creating the stone has not changed the world of metals, but has transmuted the lead of his own being into the gold of consciousness.